And a Hamas delegation will visit Cairo today for talks aimed at securing a ceasefire, as per reports, as mediators stepped up efforts to reach a deal ahead of an expected Israeli assault on Rafah. Now, this delegation is expected to discuss a ceasefire proposal handed by Hamas to mediators from Qatar and Egypt, as well as Israel's response. Now, according to reports, there is some optimism about a breakthrough as far as ceasefire talks are concerned. But the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, meanwhile, who is in the Middle East, will expand his trip and continue on to Jordan and Israel after visiting Saudi Arabia, according to the State Department spokesperson, Matthew Miller. In a statement, Mr. Miller said, Antony Blinken will focus on the effort to secure a ceasefire in Gaza that will see the release of hostages and also ensure humanitarian aid into the enclave continues or increases.
My dad had a
That's
saying.
not true.
He said, Joey, your job's about
That is simply not
And
true.
joining us for the latest details from Tel Aviv, Sarah Coates at the moment. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us on the World 24/7. Sarah, what are the outcomes we are expecting from this crucial meeting in Cairo?
Yes, good morning. Well, look, you did mention that the US President Joe Biden and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, they held that phone call very late last night. Really, Biden trying to push the Israeli leader to get this deal done, to get these 133 hostages finally released. Now, we can report, according to a number of senior unnamed Israeli officials, that this deal could see some 33 hostages released rather than 40 that Israel had previously stated that it wants, with 33 only believed to be alive in this humanitarian category, and that is women, children, the elderly and the sick. Now, there are also reports that Israel is willing to make a number of concessions, these being the return of people to the northern part of the Gaza Strip, which Israel had previously said it would not allow, especially men of fighting age, and also the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Nitzanim corridor, which is a corridor that the Israelis have made that now splits the Strip in two. Now, as you mentioned, this Hamas negotiating team will be in Cairo meeting with senior Egyptian officials a little later today. It's important to also add that an Israeli delegation has also been invited to Cairo a little later today to really try and speed up this process. But certainly this does appear as though there may be some movement in this latest round of talks. But what we do need to remember here is that there have been, many proposals put on the table. But there has always been this one sticking point, and that is the end to the war. Israel says it will continue with its operations in the Gaza Strip, including this operation down into the southern Gazan city of Rafah, which Israel believes 4 remaining Hamas battalions are stationed, while Hamas wants an end to the war, a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces, which Israel says is something that it simply will not do.
So, in a sense, there is a demand on both sides for a ceasefire, but the prospects for an actual ceasefire still remain bleak. Is that what you're hearing?
Well, certainly this is, as I mentioned, been the major sticking point time and time again. Israel says it simply will not pull out of Gaza if it doesn't go down into Rafah, where these 4 Hamas battalions, as Israel believes, are stationed. But certainly what we can expect to see over this next week is an increased delivery of aid supplies into the Gaza Strip, which is something that the Israelis have indicated that they are willing to do this week. We've also had reports that the World Central Kitchen, it will begin its operations once again today after those 7 aid workers were killed in an Israeli strike some weeks ago. So certainly really fears are mounting over this Rafah invasion. As I said, Israel says it will go ahead with this. But this is why we're really seeing this flurry of diplomacy with all of these world leaders, including US Secretary of State Blinken here in the region for his 7th visit. You mentioned he'll be in Saudi Arabia today, travelling to Israel shortly after that, really trying to listen to the Israelis and their plans over this Rafah operation, with no plan publicly released yet as to where these some 1.3 million internally displaced Palestinians that are actually sheltering in Rafah should go. So certainly a lot of concern over this region, and this is really why we're seeing this final push to try and get this deal done and to try and hold off this Rafah op.
But despite the Biden administration warning Israel against this possible Rafah invasion, the US president has signed a legislation that includes $26 billion in additional wartime assistance to Israel, if I'm not mistaken.
Certainly, and some of this money actually is for the humanitarian cause in Gaza. Analysts believe $2 billion of that will actually go down to feeding these people, rehousing these people, etc. So certainly a lot of concern. But as I did mention, Israel says it is vital for its forces to go down into Rafah, where it believes the last 4 Hamas battalions are stationed. And it also believes that this is an area where Hamas is keeping these 133 captives hidden, potentially surrounded by Hamas leaders like Yahya Sinwar down in these southern areas. So Israel certainly believes this is vital. This is why we've been seeing so much talk between the Israelis and the Egyptians. An Israeli delegation was actually in Cairo late last week discussing this Rafah operation with the Egyptians, because this is causing them a lot of security concerns, given that Rafah actually borders on Egypt, with senior officials there saying that if and when Israel actually does go down into Rafah, that this could actually jeopardise a decades-long peace treaty between the two nations if there are major spillovers of, say, tens of thousands of Palestinian refugees spilling over that border from Gaza into Egypt.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining us with that detailed update. In fact, China will host Palestinian unity talks between Hamas and Fatah in Beijing, a notable Chinese foray into Palestinian diplomacy amid the war in the Gaza Strip. As always, Sarah Coates, thank you so much for joining us live from Tel Aviv.